In the early 1980s, while much of the world was celebrating the end of stagflation and the promise of a new globalized era, another story was quietly taking shape, one that no newspaper headline captured and no politician openly discussed. It began not with armies or treaties, but with balance sheets, construction contracts, and long-term loans. China, still recovering from decades of internal upheaval, had identified something the rest of the world overlooked. Power no longer needed to come from military conquest. It could come from debt. Picture the setting. Beijing, 1983. The nation was just beginning its economic experiments, opening isolated provinces to foreign investors, studying the mechanics of Western finance, and carefully observing how infrastructure shaped influence. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping doctrines, only methodical planning. The Chinese leadership understood that countries seldom collapse from invasion. They crumble from financial dependence. And in a world hungry for roads, ports, bridges, and capital, debt offered leverage far more durable than force. Decades later, the results would be visible everywhere. Railways in Africa, ports in South Asia, highways in Eastern Europe, and mineral rights stretching across entire continents. Each project carried the same signature: Chinese loans, Chinese contractors, Chinese timelines, and the same unspoken consequence. Nations that borrowed heavily found themselves tied to Beijing not through ideology, but through repayment schedules, collateral clauses, and renegotiations that arrived precisely when economies weakened. This wasn't accidental. It was strategy. A long game played patiently, quietly, and with a level of discipline unmatched in modern finance. A campaign that turned debt into the most powerful geopolitical tool of the 21st century. To understand how China transformed debt into an instrument of global power, we have to return to a moment when the country itself seemed anything but powerful. The China of the late 1970s was poor, rural, and fractured by decades of political turmoil. Its infrastructure was limited, its industrial base outdated, and its foreign reserves so small that even minor trade imbalances created national anxiety. Yet beneath the surface of hardship, there was something more consequential taking shape. A shift in thinking at the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party. A realization that the future would not be won on battlefields but in markets. The turning point began in December 1978, when Deng Xiaoping pushed China toward reform and opening. This phrase would later become one of the most consequential in modern history. While the West saw China as merely catching up, Deng and his circle were studying something different. The mechanics of global finance, the vulnerabilities of developing nations, and the unseen architecture of economic dependence that had shaped the post-war world. They saw how Western institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and major commercial banks had extended loans across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, often leaving debtor nations trapped in cycles of refinancing and austerity. And they noticed something that many Western economists ignored. Influence did not come from the loan itself, but from the borrower's inability to repay. In 1979, China sent thousands of scholars, engineers, and economic planners abroad. They weren't tourists, nor were they ideological missionaries. They were observers, quiet, meticulous analysts who examined how ports, factories, and pipelines were financed. They studied European export credit agencies, Japanese development loans, and the structure of American-led institutions. What they saw was a world desperate for infrastructure but unable to pay for it without conditions that often favored the lender. It was a lesson China would internalize deeply. At home, the Chinese leadership confronted its own challenges. The nation's infrastructure was aging. Railways were overloaded, ports lacked capacity, and electricity shortages routinely halted production. Deng recognized that economic development required a foundation of physical infrastructure, and he understood that building it from scratch would demand enormous capital China did not yet have. So China initially used debt the traditional way, borrowing from Japan and Western institutions to accelerate development in coastal provinces. But while accepting these loans, Chinese economists were examining the fine print, the collateral arrangements, the repayment terms, the political leverage that often accompanied financing. They were learning the rules of the game so they could eventually write their own. By the late 1982, a new internal doctrine began to shape elite discussions. China had concluded that infrastructure was not merely an economic asset, it was geopolitical currency. Any nation that controlled a port, a rail line, or an energy corridor held influence over the flow of commodities, trade, and strategic goods. And influence, once embedded, was hard to dislodge. Roads and bridges could be rebranded, but ownership contracts, interest payments, and operating rights created ties that lasted decades. But China faced its own constraint. It had no global currency, no multinational banks, and no established development agency. What it did have was something equally valuable: patience. Chinese strategists believed their rise would take generations. They were willing to move slowly, to invest in relationships long before returns materialized, and to deploy financing in ways that made sense not only for economics, but for political strategy. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 accelerated this shift. For the first time in centuries, China saw a world without a dominant ideological rival. The United States was unchallenged, global markets were opening, and developing nations were seeking new partners beyond Western lenders. China saw an opening. If it positioned itself as an alternative source of capital without the political conditions or austerity measures that Western institutions demanded, it could build influence across continents without firing a shot. This idea matured during Jiang Zemin's presidency. In the mid-1990s, Chinese state-owned enterprises were restructured, creating a cadre of construction giants capable of building massive infrastructure projects abroad. At the same time, Chinese banks, especially the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank, were given new mandates. Their mission was to project Chinese capacity outward, but the real breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: China's internal development model. As China built highways, dams, airports, and megacities within its own borders, it created a template it could later export. Domestic infrastructure became a training ground. Chinese firms learned how to build quickly, cheaply, and at scale. They developed systems for transporting materials across long distances, coordinating labor, and managing complex logistics. And all the while, Chinese planners understood that one day they could replicate this model beyond their borders, not as charity, but as strategy. By the early 2000s, China had accumulated foreign reserves at an unprecedented pace. The nation's rapid growth, fueled by exports, provided more capital than the government could deploy internally. This surplus created a dilemma. If China invested heavily in Western markets, it would strengthen the same powers it sought to quietly outmaneuver. But if it invested in developing nations, countries hungry for infrastructure but starved of funding, it could create long-term dependencies. Debt would become the bridge linking those nations to Beijing. It was during this period that the seeds of a new global strategy were planted. Chinese planners proposed ideas that sounded benign: helping nations develop, improving trade connectivity, promoting mutual growth. Yet behind the diplomatic language was a clear calculation. If China could finance and construct critical infrastructure abroad, ports, railways, energy grids, it would gain not only economic returns, but strategic footholds. And because the financing came through loans rather than grants, those footholds would be secured by binding financial obligations that could last decades. Everything was moving slowly, almost imperceptibly. China was still portraying itself as a developing nation, one focused on internal challenges. China was preparing to use the very mechanism that once constrained it debt to reshape the global order. Step by step, loan by loan, contract by contract, it was constructing the foundation of a new kind of influence, one built not on ideology or force, but on financial gravity. Debt would become China's most subtle and powerful tool, not because debt itself was new, but because China intended to use it differently. Not as temporary assistance, but as a long-term strategic architecture, one that could bind nations quietly, durably, and with consequences that would unfold over generations. China's ascent from a cautious, infrastructure-hungry nation to a global creditor did not happen suddenly. It unfolded through decisions that appeared technical, even mundane, but collectively formed one of the most ambitious economic strategies of the modern era. By the early 2000s, China had achieved something few developing countries ever had: a massive surplus of capital. Its export-driven growth model produced an enormous stockpile of foreign reserves money that had to be deployed somewhere. And while much of the world assumed China would recycle that capital into U.S. Treasury bonds indefinitely, Beijing had a different plan brewing beneath the surface. The first sign came through the transformation of its state banks. The China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China were no longer simple policy lenders. They were being quietly positioned as global power instruments. Their loan portfolios expanded dramatically, backed not by short-term speculation, but by long-term strategic thinking. These banks started offering financing to developing nations that Western institutions had largely overlooked, countries burdened by political instability, high debt, or limited creditworthiness. While the IMF attached conditions, China offered speed. It was a different kind of relationship, built not on governance but on assets. This set the stage for China's most transformative move, the Belt and Road Initiative. Announced in 2013, it appeared to be an ambitious program to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through roads, ports, railways, and pipelines. But China had already spent years laying the groundwork. The Belt and Road merely formalized what China had been building quietly: a global network of infrastructure financed by Chinese loans, constructed by Chinese companies, and guaranteed by the long-term obligations of the recipient nations. Ports became the centerpiece. China understood that maritime access was both an economic lifeline and a geopolitical choke point. Investments flowed into Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, Pakistan's Gwadar port, Greece's Piraeus port, and dozens more across the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean. Each project was framed as cooperation, but the financing structures told a deeper story. Loans were often issued at commercial rates, bundled with clauses that allowed China to renegotiate terms or assume control of assets if countries struggled to repay. These arrangements were not hidden. They were simply written in contracts few local leaders fully understood. Railways followed. China built high-speed lines in Southeast Asia, freight corridors across Central Asia, and industrial rail links in Africa. These were not random projects. Each line expanded China's ability to move commodities, energy, or manufacturing inputs through channels it effectively controlled. And every mile of track deepened the borrower's reliance on Chinese technology, maintenance, and financing. But the most critical shift wasn't in steel or concrete. China positioned itself as a partner unconcerned with ideology, willing to move quickly and ready to fund projects others deemed too risky. Presidents, ministers, and political elites, often facing elections or internal pressures, embraced Chinese funding as an opportunity to deliver visible progress without confronting budgetary limits. Roads could be built, power plants could rise, ports could be modernized. The cost would come later. This approach produced a wave of goodwill across continents. Leaders praised China as a nation willing to invest where others hesitated. But underneath this enthusiasm, another dynamic was quietly taking shape. Chinese companies didn't just build projects. They imported Chinese labor, equipment, and engineering firms. Money technically left Beijing, but much of it flowed back through contracts awarded to Chinese companies. The borrower was left with the debt. China kept the revenue. As the Belt and Road expanded, China's diplomatic posture shifted. It moved from observer to convener, hosting summits, signing memorandums of understanding, and embedding financial relationships into long-term national development plans. What appeared to be economic cooperation was, in reality, the creation of a financial ecosystem tied to Beijing. By the late 2010 seconds, the scale was undeniable. China had become the world's largest bilateral creditor, surpassing even the World Bank and IMF combined. Its loans extended to more than 150 countries. Nations that once relied on Western institutions found themselves increasingly bound to Chinese financing. And because these debts were often opaque, shielded from public scrutiny by confidentiality clauses, citizens had little understanding of the obligations their governments had undertaken. China's rise as a global lender was not accidental. It was the result of decades of disciplined planning, consistent investment, and an unwavering belief that economic leverage would shape the 21st century more powerfully than military force. By financing the world's infrastructure, China was building something far more valuable than ports or roads. It was building dependence, structural, financial, and deeply rooted. The world, meanwhile, saw only the surface. Construction cranes, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and diplomatic slogans about connectivity and development. What they failed to grasp was the deeper reality. Nations were not merely receiving infrastructure. They were entering long-term financial relationships with a creditor whose goals were fundamentally strategic. By the time leaders realized the scale of their commitments, China's rise was no longer a possibility. It was an established fact. The turning point came when the optimism surrounding China's global lending collided with the realities of repayment. For many nations, Chinese financing initially felt like a lifeline, fast, flexible, and free of political lectures. But loans, no matter how generous they appear, eventually mature. And when they did, the cracks began to appear. It started quietly. A missed payment here. A request for restructuring there. Oil prices fell, tourism slowed, currencies weakened, and governments that had borrowed heavily suddenly found themselves unable to meet their obligations. The same leaders who once celebrated Chinese-funded megaprojects now faced mounting pressure as debt service costs devoured national budgets. Behind closed doors, negotiations grew tense. Chinese loan officers were not diplomats. They were accountants, trained to protect Beijing's interests. They insisted on collateral. They demanded operating rights. They pressed for extensions of leases, control of ports, stakes in utilities, or preferential access to natural resources. They were contractual pathways written years earlier, activated precisely when nations became financially weakest. Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka became the defining example, a modern facility built with Chinese loans that generated almost no revenue. When repayment faltered, Sri Lanka agreed to lease the port to China for 99 years. The transfer was legal. It was voluntary, and yet it was unavoidable. Sri Lanka simply had no other options. What had begun as development had become dependency. Across Africa, similar patterns emerged. Nations that borrowed for highways and power plants found themselves renegotiating terms, mortgaging future mineral output, or granting Chinese firms long-term concessions. Political elites faced a dangerous dilemma: admit mismanagement, or frame Chinese pressure as economic inevitability. Most chose the latter. Within many borrowing nations, the public slowly realized the consequences. Projects designed to symbolize national progress now represented loss of control. Ports no longer felt sovereign. Railways depended on foreign technicians. Power stations required parts sourced exclusively from Chinese suppliers. Debt had not only financed infrastructure, it had influenced national policy, shaped budgets, and constrained political freedom. While corruption played a role in some cases, contracts awarded without oversight, inflated cost estimates, and political favoritism, the core issue went deeper than mismanagement. It was structural. China's lending model concentrated power at the top. And because the agreements were often classified, citizens discovered the details only when repayment crises erupted. But conflict did not arise solely from the debtor side. China, too, found itself facing challenges it had not fully anticipated. Some nations resisted renegotiation. Others refused to surrender assets. China's reputation, once built on non-interference, began to fracture as critics accused it of debt-trap diplomacy, a phrase Beijing rejected, but one that captured rising global suspicion. Even Chinese planners faced internal tension. State-owned enterprises, desperate to keep their overseas projects afloat, pushed for more loans. Even when borrowers were struggling, banks worried about defaults but were under political pressure to continue financing strategic projects. The very system China had carefully constructed was now revealing its vulnerabilities: overextension, opaque accounting, and the risk that political priorities could distort financial discipline. Meanwhile, Western governments began challenging China's rise more openly. The United States warned allies about strategic risks. Europe accused China of buying influence. Japan and India launched their own competing infrastructure programs. Debt, once quietly deployed, had become a geopolitical fault line. For the first time, China's strategy faced coordinated resistance, but the deeper conflict was not between China and the West. It was between China and the realities of its own ambition. Beijing had built a system that relied on the assumption that borrowers would grow fast enough to repay. When that growth slowed due to political instability, commodity shocks, or global economic downturns, the entire model strained under pressure. The world now saw the truth clearly. China had not merely financed infrastructure. It had woven itself into the financial architecture of dozens of nations. And when those nations struggled, China was forced to choose between enforcing contracts and protecting its reputation as a benevolent partner. The result was a global landscape marked by tension, financial, political, and diplomatic. China, once confident in its rising influence, confronted the complexities of being a global creditor, and the quiet strategy that had propelled China for decades entered a turbulent new phase 1 defined not by construction, but by conflict. By the early 2022s, China's vast lending network faced pressures from every direction. The model that had once appeared unstoppable, simple in structure, elegant in strategy, was now colliding with an unpredictable global reality. Economic slowdowns, political instability, pandemics, and commodity shocks exposed the fragility of nations that had borrowed heavily. And as repayment schedules tightened, the world entered a phase China had not fully prepared for. Systemic stress across multiple continents at the same time. The first wave came from Africa. Countries that had relied on oil, copper, and agricultural exports saw revenues collapse. Debt service payments that once seemed manageable suddenly outweighed healthcare budgets or education funding. Requests for relief poured in, not just from one or two states, but from dozens. China, now the largest bilateral creditor to developing nations, found itself pulled into debates it had tried to avoid: global debt forgiveness, transparency standards, and restructuring frameworks guided by institutions it did not control. Then came Asia. Sri Lanka's crisis drew international headlines, but it was far from alone. Laos struggled to manage its hydroelectric commitments. Pakistan faced a balance of payments emergency that threatened the future of its flagship projects. Even Malaysia, with a stronger economy, sought to renegotiate Chinese-backed infrastructure deals. These were not isolated stories. They reflected a deeper pattern. Debt that had been issued during periods of optimism was becoming a burden in times of contraction. Inside China, the strain was equally visible. China's real estate sector began to unravel. Local governments struggled with debt. Growth slowed. The financial institutions responsible for supporting the Belt and Road Initiative could no longer operate as if global lending was an unlimited, risk-free endeavor. Bank officers grew cautious. Politicians grew divided. The once unified vision of outward expansion became entangled with internal economic anxieties. This was the hinge moment, when China had to decide what kind of global power it intended to be. It could tighten control, seize assets, impose strict repayment terms, and protect its financial exposure at any cost. Or it could restructure, negotiate, and accept losses to preserve long-term influence. Either path carried consequences. Beijing chose a hybrid approach. Some assets were quietly acquired under long leases, especially in strategically important locations. Others were renegotiated to avoid public backlash. In certain nations, China extended loans with new terms, preserving relationships at the expense of short-term profit. The strategy was no longer uniform. It was reactive, an improvised response to a global environment that had shifted rapidly. Meanwhile, the political climate in borrowing nations changed. Public protests targeted leaders who had signed opaque contracts. Workers criticized Chinese firms for excluding local labor. Environmental groups challenged the side effects of major construction projects. Governments that once embraced China began distancing themselves, seeking alternative partners, or reopening negotiations they previously considered settled. This period marked the transformation of China's debt strategy. It was no longer enough to export capital and build infrastructure. China had to manage the aftermath, the political fallout, the financial fragility, and the reputational damage of being perceived as a creditor, unwilling to forgive. Yet collapse did not come, at least not in the way critics predicted. China adjusted. It slowed the pace of lending, diversified its investments, and began participating, though reluctantly, in international debt discussions. It restructured some loans in Africa, offered temporary relief to Asian partners, and shifted its Belt and Road narrative from grand expansion to sustainable cooperation. What emerged from this turmoil was a different model. Less aggressive, more cautious, driven not by unchecked ambition but by the recognition that global power carries obligations as well as advantages. China's strategy did not disappear. It changed. It adapted to a world that suddenly demanded transparency, accountability, and balance. The era of rapid, unrestrained lending had ended. What replaced it was a complex, slower, and more negotiated approach. An evolution shaped by both necessity and experience. The quiet machinery of influence, built over decades, had reached its limits. To move forward, China had to rethink not only how it lent, but why. And in that shift, from expansion to recalibration, the next chapter of its global role began. When the world looks back on China's rise as a global creditor, the story will not be remembered simply as a tale of infrastructure, contracts, or balance sheets. It will be remembered as a moment when the definition of power itself changed. For centuries, influence was measured in armies, territory, and military alliances. But China demonstrated something different, something quieter, and in many ways more enduring. It showed that financial dependency could shape nations more profoundly than force ever could. Yet the legacy of China's debt-driven strategy is complicated. It is a story of ambition meeting reality, of strength tempered by consequence, and of nations discovering the cost of choices made during moments of optimism. For developing countries, the legacy is mixed. China provided infrastructure the world genuinely needed. Ports that once sat idle now hum with activity. Highways shortened travel times that had defined entire regions for generations. In many cases, these were achievements no other global actor was willing to fund. But these gains came with burdens. Debt levels soared. Governments built projects faster than their economies could absorb. Some leaders treated Chinese loans as political tools, using them to win elections rather than strengthen long-term stability. And when repayment crises emerged, nations confronted the uncomfortable truth that infrastructure alone does not guarantee prosperity. A port without trade routes is a liability. A railway without industry is a cost. A power plant without customers is a drain on the budget. China provided the hardware, but the software governance, planning, and sustainability remained unresolved. For China, the legacy is equally complex. Its rise as a global lender expanded its influence beyond anything the country had achieved in modern history. It gained strategic assets, political leverage, and global recognition as a central player in international development. But it also inherited the role and liabilities of a major creditor. It discovered that power does not end with the loan. It continues through renegotiation, crisis management, and public perception. Beijing entered arenas it once avoided. Transparency forums, debt restructuring negotiations, and multilateral relief discussions. In many ways, China confronted the paradox faced by all great powers. The most lasting transformation, however, occurred in how the world perceives debt itself. China's strategy made nations more aware of the vulnerabilities embedded in long-term borrowing. It forced governments to confront the consequences of opaque agreements. It pushed international organizations to rethink their roles and fueled global debates about fair lending, sovereign debt, and the balance between development and dependence. But the deepest legacy may be philosophical. China's rise exposed something fundamental about modern global systems. Power today often flows through agreements that are neither democratic nor transparent. It flows through financial structures that bind nations quietly, gradually, and sometimes irreversibly. And it revealed that the distinction between assistance and leverage can be narrow, so narrow that nations often recognize the difference only when the crisis arrives. As the world moves forward, China's strategy will be studied, debated, criticized, and imitated. Borrowers will become more cautious, and China itself will continue refining its model, shaped by the lessons of decades of overseas lending. The story does not end with collapse. It ends with a transformation, a recognition that debt is no longer merely an economic tool, but a geopolitical force, capable of redrawing alliances, reordering markets, and shifting the balance of global power without a single soldier crossing a border. In the decades ahead, the nations tied to China through these financial agreements will navigate their futures with a mix of gratitude, resentment, hope, and caution. And China, now firmly established as a global lender, will face the challenge of sustaining influence without triggering backlash, of fostering development without breeding dependency, and of remaining powerful without appearing predatory. The global economy is now permanently intertwined with China's decisions, and the world must learn how to live with a creditor whose ambitions extend far beyond profit. This story reveals how power in the modern world often hides in contracts rather than conflicts, in obligations rather than occupations. Debt can build nations or bind them, and the difference depends on whether those who lend and those who borrow understand the true cost of the agreement. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.